And truth and grace and all the merry crew, the laughing winds and rivers and live hours, and hope, the dewy-eyed and sorrowing song, yes, with much woe and mourning general at dead youth's funeral. Even these were met once more together all, who erst the fair and living youth did know. All, except only love. Love had died long ago. Grace is totally deranged. She deals with the dead more than with the living. She's been attending graves ever since her early childhood, which of course affected her psyche. Grace serves as a guardian spirit to the local cemetery, much like Mother Superior to the termitary. She talks to the dead a lot. Occasionally she sits beside a grave and sings. At night she makes the rounds of the graveyard, brings gifts to the dead, strange tokens at times, a typewriter carriage, or birthday cake with candles. Grace has an ear for music, but doesn't play any musical instruments. She sings mesmerizingly, but her voice breaks as if she's struggling to breathe. She feels the consequences of disease like no one else does. To Grace, the relationship with the world of the dead is so volatile that she isn't bothered much by the dead seeping into the world of the living. It's something scary, but reasonable. Cracked palm, smeared with dirt, dry eyes, bent knees, dark coat frayed at the edges, a white collar, bold against death's horizon, blonde hair shifting in the plague-touched wind. A cart, laden with corpses, winds its way towards the graveyard. There are not enough holes in the ground to take them all. And the whispers, always whispers. It never ends. Stressed, isolated, alone, while also being relaxed, at peace, and entranced by the beauty of life and death entwining and encroaching on one another. The story of the 15-year-old graveyard keeper Grace is one of human connection, even on the fringe of both the narrative and the town. She is ostracized as a natural consequence of her position in the town's hierarchy, and just the time it takes someone to walk to see her. Who would look after a lonely steward of death? Yet, despite this, she is brave, kind, and thoughtful. She has many admirable qualities, despite her oddities and position in the game world. I chose that poem at the beginning of the video because her story is a story of shedding youth, while also, perhaps, still being able to be at its vigil. Even as things change, Grace can hear and remember. We can remember. Grace is the most outsider character of the termites, perhaps of the entire game. She exists on the fringe of society at the border of death. Grace is a lonely girl, forced to tend to the overwhelming demands of the dead. Most of the time, no one besides the player stands up for her or cares for her to any significant degree, aside from Capella, Clara, and Isidore Burak at the beginning of the game. Maybe you could argue that the Sabarovs also care for her, but not to enough of a degree to actually remove her from the graveyard. Not until the end of Pathologic, anyway. So, what is it that makes Grace tick? How can we relate to her? There are, I think, 3 key avenues of her character to explore. Firstly, how she relates to loneliness and isolation, and her resilience in the face of that. Secondly, how we, the player, relate to both her and the graveyard as a part of the town. And thirdly, the way in which the dead figure into her character. How are the dead presented in Pathologic? What separates that from the way in which death is presented in other video games? And how on earth does a 15 or 14-year-old girl fit into all of this?
I've been forgotten, and now I'm mouldering here.
Loneliness in video games is a topic that I love to linger on, but it is hard to find sources that relate to the feeling of in-game isolation, rather than the feelings of social isolation that staying inside and playing video games can generate. Isolation and loneliness can also be harder to find in modern video games, primarily because of their connection to a variety of online services. Even playing a single-player game on Steam, for instance, comes with a connection to the messaging system. Anyone you want to talk to is just a few button presses and mouse clicks away. Notifications identify when your friends are online or when someone's messaged you. Your phone can buzz in the middle of the game, or you can get an invite to play something else. That's why we should acknowledge that when certain games or characters make you feel lonely, even in spite of how connected our digital world is, it is a genuinely remarkable feat. Master's student Evan Agramson Neistekro writes in their thesis on video game music and loneliness that there are 3 categories of loneliness. Solitude, where we seek comfort by ourselves. Loneliness itself, which is the depressing feeling related to social isolation, when a person craves social interaction but are unable to get enough of it. And isolation, where we have forced physical separation from other people. When a person is locked into a room alone, they are isolated from others. Loneliness, they say, is the sad version of the emotion, which I think helps us to define Grace's character, along with a bit of forced isolation based on her position in the town's social hierarchy. Because loneliness is an integral part, a cornerstone really, of Grace's character. The physical situation of the graveyard at the far end of town, separated from the town by a train track, is not the only thing that reminds us that Grace is an unwanted element. No one in the town particularly wants to talk to her, because they think she talks only to the dead. This is reinforced in a brutal feedback loop where Grace only talks to the dead because no one living, seemingly, wants to come and see her. That's not quite true, of course, within the narrative, but as far as gameplay goes and what we actually see on screen, Grace is almost always alone. Grace is almost always kneeling in Pathologic 2, unlike the first game, where she stands like a thin willow branch, always indoors, as though a breeze would cause her to snap in half or crumble into dust. That initial description of her in the first game's design document is cruel. Deranged, I think, is a harsh word to use when discussing a child who has undergone incredible hardship in her backstory, but also illuminating in details that don't really get to make it into the full game. The little bit about having an ear for music but struggling to sing as though out of breath is deeply humanizing, I think. Also deeply sad. The Pathologic wiki helpfully observes Grace's Russian name, as I am still not fluent enough in Russian to play Pathologic, one of life's greatest tragedies. So, Grace's Russian name, Laska, means both weasel and tenderness. I feel as though the latter is much more relevant, of course, given her position as a kind, wide-eyed, open-hearted character. She seems for the most part fairly easy to read, and she is also similarly easy to like and grow to care for. Most players, I find, want to make sure that she is protected and looked after at all times. And when we consider a feeling of isolation or loneliness, we often do so from, presumably, our position of adulthood, or at least having grown up out of childhood. Loneliness, then, as a grown person, means something a lot different to loneliness as a child. As an adult, I tend to think of myself when I'm lonely as lonely for now. As adults, there's generally a certain amount of autonomy we have to at least attempt to connect with people. This is not by any means a universal experience, of course, but generally as an adult, we have at least more autonomy and potential to enter new social situations than a child. In Grace's instance, however, her social position means that she is isolated and has very little autonomy to meet with anyone new who does not come to see her personally. Similar in gameplay, she is not afforded any opportunity to leave the graveyard, at least to start with. Loneliness happens a lot to everyone as well. Psychologists and researchers Louise Hawkley and John Cacioppo write that loneliness is a common experience. As many as 80% of those under 18 years of age and 40% of adults over 65 years of age report being lonely at least sometimes, with levels of loneliness gradually diminishing through the middle adult years and then increasing in old age, i.e. greater than 70 years. People can live relatively solitary lives and not feel lonely, and conversely, they can live an ostensibly rich social life and feel lonely nevertheless. They continue, saying that loneliness has been associated with personality disorders and psychoses, suicide, impaired cognitive performance and cognitive decline over time, increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, diminished executive control, and increases in depressive symptoms. Loneliness is certainly not helping Grace to cope with her unusual, stressful situation. She's just expected to cope, just expected to manage. Additionally, however, we could argue, thanks to her connection to the dead, that she does not consider herself alone or lonely. Her loneliness may, at least partially, just be something we pin on her from an outsider's perspective. For now, let us look at trauma and loneliness from the perspective of a child. On the website CT Mirror, they explain, thousands of children suffer from trauma, or what experts call traumatic dysregulation. When children are overwhelmed by a traumatic event, their ability to think in a linear fashion is compromised, and their coping mechanism goes haywire. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network estimates that 26% of children will experience a traumatic event by age 4. Imagine if you feel small or frightened all the time. Imagine if you can't get rid of intrusive thoughts about the original traumatic experience, said Stephen Moran's, director of the Childhood Violent Trauma Center at the Yale Child Study Center and professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. These are burdens that the developing child is not able to adequately negotiate and master. Obviously, these are really terrifying statistics and descriptions. It is thus easy to forget Grace's age at times based on how she is written, which I like. She is still childlike and innocent at times, but she is deceptively strong-willed. Grace is so well written that she seems to fit into this kind of framework, even as a fictional character. Grace talks in a circuitous, somewhat confronting way, perhaps as a result of her parents' addiction to Twyrine. Her mother drank Twyrine while pregnant with her, and her father died of a Twyrine overdose, leaving her in charge of the graveyard at 12 years old. Due to the nature of the town's hierarchy, no one really saw a problem with this, at least not enough to remove her from her position. Because of the influence of Twyrine on her life and the social isolation, her dialogue trees begin in one place and end somewhere completely different. Now, this is true of all characters in Pathologic sometimes, but I feel that at times Grace has a real talent for it. Over the course of the game, she experiences a lot of trauma, then, on a daily basis. She's being confronted with the spirits of the hundreds of dead, and she herself has no outlet and no one to talk to, at least until the 3 healers come along. In other words, until the player comes along, in one of their guises.
Even if we all have to lay down our lives here, the town itself must live. They don't make towns like this anymore.
The player is in a weird position in Pathologic. We are made to understand our inherent privilege as a player in the game, as Pathologic makes us aware of the power we hold over the other characters in the town, who tend to be non-actors from a game mechanic sense. We cannot fight and kill them, we do not see them walk around town. They're in one building when they need to be, standing fixed in one spot, and then they are in another someday. The plot does what it will with the characters in Pathologic, and the game's meta-narrative supports this. The town is but a fiction concocted by the minds of children, but fictions concocted by the minds of the developers at Icepick Lodge. So any feelings of the world seeming artificial can be waved away as intentional. The game systems are there because we are a part of a game world. As game studies scholars Muriel and Crawford write, video games and their culture can help us understand wider social topics such as agency, power, everyday life, and identity in contemporary society. Actually being able to interact with the world in which we play is helped along by our understanding of space. Grace is set apart from the world in a very deliberate way. She is closest to the Haruspex's lair and Asperty's home, but beyond that she is a very long way indeed from the actual bulk of the living population. Although I suppose a large number of those people decide to migrate to see Grace over the course of the game. We could argue that the game world of Pathologic is part of, or an offshoot of, the modern Gothic. The Gothic in video games is often obvious and easy to spot. In many ways, the potential for non-linear storytelling of a video game is ideal for replaying Gothic conventions. In Gothic music, Sounds of the Uncanny, Isabella van Elferen says that a labyrinthine setting and dark colours alone do not define the genre, which is also characterized by hauntology, hauntography, and transgression. Fans of my channel's previous videos will be familiar with my obsession with the idea of hauntology. You'll be wondering whether they can get through even one video without it. I have explored hauntology much more thoroughly in various videos. It's probably best to go there to get a fuller breakdown, but for now, hauntology is the study of elements that return from the past, like spectres. In the context of Grace's place in Pathologic, the Gothic makes itself manifest in her surroundings and narrative. Take her cramped, awful little lodge room in the original game. It is, I think, one of the most hostile places, even if nothing that bad happens there. It is nasty and kind of green, with statues on the sides of the room. Hardly any room to move at all. In Artemy's story, one of the men he assaults lies near Grace, hunched over, curled into a ball, dying and covered in his own blood. There's also an incredible piece of concept art worth highlighting that I think summarizes Grace's relationship to the cemetery. She half leans against a towering, spiked monument, surrounded by graves as far as the eye can see. For Grace, there is only the loneliness of the cemetery, and her life is dominated by these moments that we as a player can also explore. Alpharin argues that the participatory uncanny of certain games can be identified as the main ingredient of video game Gothic. We are interacting with a 14 or 15-year-old girl who runs a graveyard, positioned as the steward of the dead who can hear their whispers. The participatory uncanny here is clear. We interact with her in the place she calls home, and we are fascinated by her presence as totally unusual and unfamiliar. It gives us a window into the ritual structures of the town, including how they handle death and dying, which I'll of course cover in the next section of the video. Additionally, the Gothic manifests in Pathologic in the way that we control our characters. Michael Hancock writes that video games as a medium can be usefully thought of as inherently Gothic in the way that they are predicated on doubling and repetition. Even when the game's narratives don't rely on Gothic mechanics, this doubling is still inherent in the gameplay itself. In other words, how we inhabit a character and control them essentially doubles ourselves, and the repetition of returning in Pathologic is present because of 2 points. Firstly, the game is quite long, and also at points can be, shall we say, difficult for first-time players, meaning that we will have to do the same things over and over again. Sometimes this includes whole conversations with a character like Grace, or treks to or from the cemetery over and over again. Secondly, we inhabit 3 different characters and see the town from 3 different perspectives. So, for now, let us consider how each character relates to Grace. I think the most distant relationship a player character has with Grace is the Bachelor. There is always a sense of dismissiveness, as the Bachelor is the outsider character, meaning he never really understands why a girl would be left in charge of a graveyard. This is reinforced in the Graveyard Mouseover on the Marble Nest map, where the Bachelor is playable, where it reads, "An underage girl used to be in charge of the funerals. Small wonder everything went to hell." Yet his conversations with her and interactions with the graveyard while playing as him are still important. Take the moment at the end of Classic HD where the Bachelor is dumped in the graveyard after a botched execution by the renegade soldiers. Fighting his way to Grace and getting her assistance is important, and that is, I think, how I remember Grace the most strongly, as a character who can help us retrieve ourselves from the fringes of the game's society. This extends to our relationship with her when we are playing as Artemy. In the original game, the Haruspex goes to her to pull his reputation back from the brink in that aforementioned side quest, where we are tasked with healing one of the men Artemy almost killed. This moment allows us to define Artemy as we play him, rather than how the story presents him, and Grace is the kind person who can help us to do that. She looks after the man either way, I suppose. Otherwise, when we play as Artemy, the expectation is that we protect her in every way, as she is a member of the Bound. When Artemy finds her at death's door due to the supernatural stress put on her by the clamouring voices of the dead, leaving her to her fate causes her to die. But listening to her is enough to save her life, I believe, though a player can also elect to have the bodies burned to silence the voices, or allow the rat prophet to steal their souls. This choice being resolved with no negative outcome in this way tells us that Grace really, desperately, just wants someone to listen to her. Pathologic 2 changes Grace's relationship to the town itself if we decide to help her and then agree to Dora Fugel's request. If we do, Grace moves in with Peter Stomartin. As nice as this kind of relationship is, I think there's also something odd about moving a girl who has already seen the negative effects of an alcoholic parental figure who is now living with the town's most infamous alcoholic. It's an interesting narrative choice that also puts a lot of pressure on Peter, who already puts a lot of pressure on himself. Maybe it will turn out fine, and I do enjoy how the two of them care for one another in their own ways, but I can't help but wonder as to how satisfying this ending is for Grace, given how important she is to the graveyard. But maybe I'm thinking of this in the wrong terms. Maybe the most important part is that she is more than the graveyard. Even if the arrangement with Peter is temporary, she is adopted by the Sabarovs in the diurnal ending anyway. But Grace is more than the place she shepherds, and she is also more than the potential mistress of death she becomes in the nocturnal ending, or the beige mistress she becomes when she grows up after the events of the Haruspex ending in the original Pathologic. And returning to the psychological effects of loneliness, Hawkley and Kakiopo write that human sociality is prominent even in contemporary and individualistic societies. Almost 80% of our waking hours are spent with others, and on average, time spent with friends, relatives, spouses, children, and co-workers is rated more inherently rewarding than time spent alone. Humans are such meaning-making creatures that we also perceive social relationships where no objectifiable relationship exists, e.g. between author and reader, or between an individual and God, or where no reciprocity is possible, e.g. in parasocial relationships with television characters. Perhaps having a long-lasting relationship with someone else, whoever it is the greatest gift we as a player can give to Grace. Or perhaps her sociability with the dead would work its magic too. Grace's relationship with Clara, I think, is perhaps the most important out of the player characters, and it is the one that I think most players who have played Changeling's route reflect on most fondly. Grace is the first character you can interact with, and she always believes in Clara. Even as Artemy's story is about protecting Grace, Clara's story relates more strongly to her. They are entwined on the same page, as both come into powers that neither currently fully understands, and deals with responsibility beyond what people of their age normally have to deal with. In a rapidly changing actual world, Grace and Clara's relationship is one that feels strong and natural, as the two can relate to one another. Changeling can also often be found in Grace's lodge when playing as the other characters, further reinforcing the two characters' importance to one another, and the importance of the graveyard as a place where characters ostracized or misunderstood by society find themselves, just like Artemy has a lot of interaction with her at the beginning of the game. I found myself checking in on her in my first Changeling playthrough quite a lot, just to make sure that she was still okay. She ends up adopted by the Sabarovs in the end potentially, taking Clara's role even as we guide Clara to a new space, a new place in the town as its spiritual leader, and that, I think, works in a very satisfying thematic way. Overall then, a player's relationship to Grace is defined by her position at the edge of town, and also how we understand her relationship to the player character. The graveyard is a place where we commit crimes, such as killing guards who protect infected bodies that we need samples from, or where we pull ourselves out from reputation-related black holes. The role that the Gothic plays, an uncanny disjunction of little graveyard girl who can speak to the dead, and the tragic narrative that can take place if we let Grace succumb to loneliness, overwork, or the plague itself, is also important to note. There is, of course, one final point I want to address about Grace. How does she, and by extension, how do we, relate to the dead?
The dead know no greed.
The dead are insatiable creatures. Even when buried, they cry out for space in Pathologic. They want their own rooms, they demand their own things. They want to be at peace, but they simply cannot be. Stuffed into cramped boxes or even tossed half-heartedly into deep mass burial pits, the dead struggle against us. Death in video games is often a very transient or fleeting thing. Death or violence is doled out cheaply, and often the consequences of that violence do not happen to be explored in video games. Part of that cheapness is the fact you can save, quit and reload at any time in many video games. Pathologic 2 attempts to deal with the simple fact of death with various design choices. The first and most relevant is that saving is done only at specific locations. The ticking of clocks, the notion that time is always going on, this is a key part of both Death and Pathologic, with the discussions that we have with characters being one of the only ways to freeze time in-game. Additionally, Death comes with penalties, setting us back not just temporarily, but with health, hunger, or other punishments, such as being unable to hug. Scholar Viola Nicolucci writes that death in video games is a totally temporary experience. Losing represents temporary failure on the path to mastery. As feedback, the protagonist's death could even be considered a learning tool for the player to improve their performance. In other words, we tend not to take death very seriously in video games. But what if we started to? Emotions in video games can be defined by 3 different categories, Doris Ruch argues. If we are to approach a video game or a video game character in a humanistic way, we can use Ruch's tools to examine them. The 3 tools are procedurality, fictional alignment, and emotional metaphor. As she says, playing games elicits emotions. If you're watching a video on Pathologic, you've probably already arrived at this particular conclusion. She continues, the game can carry the fiction, while the fiction adjusts the course of where the journey is going. The game part brings in the affective strength of the real-world activity, and the fiction contextualizes those game emotions and enables players to attribute them to the events in the game world. So in other words, the game's message can be delivered and assigned to the gameplay in the case of a video game. For the player of Pathologic, death is the enemy. You are playing as a healer, after all. That is the role we are supposed to inhabit. For Grace, however, death is comfortable. Death is the reassuring part of her life that keeps her employed, that keeps her stable, that gives her companionship, that helps her matter to the town. Death being comfortable is highly unusual, of course, in our own modern society that in my experience does not much like to reflect on death and dying. Writing about narrative, death and video games, Nicolucci writes that narrative is a vehicle for conveying meaning and value, resulting in a change in perspective through the learning process. What provides us all with a sense of meaning, both in life and generally in stories, is death. Although death is ubiquitous in the news media, in movies and in video games, when it comes to thinking about it in our personal lives, we live in full death denial. Grace's presence in the narrative and game world of Pathologic is a way for the player to at least begin to comprehend death as it affects a world both similar and dissimilar to our own. The unfamiliar elements help us to grapple with the familiar fears. The idea that death helps Grace matter and contribute to society is true throughout most of the game's story. The entirety of the original game, for example, rests on her being the graveyard's keeper and steward. Only in Pathologic 2 does this change during the events of the game itself, and is her character allowed to break that shackle through player-dependent choice, as discussed in the previous section. The biggest revelation I had about Pathologic's cemetery is that it acts as a kind of focus for the dead. Whereas children gather in the town's other focus, the polyhedron, and Simon's soul makes itself at home there, the intact bodies of the dead can make manifest their dreams and hopes and fears, with Grace being the conduit who can hear those voices. If the Sabarovs both die at the end of Pathologic 2, and Grace survives to reach the diurnal ending, Grace is still adopted by them, since she can hear them perfectly clearly. Her relationship to death is all important then, and we can change our own opinions on death in Pathologic just by being there for the girl that can hear death, that can understand them, just as we can as Artemy in Pathologic 2. Death itself is a taunting, mocking figure to the player in Pathologic 2, but Grace doesn't seem to encounter that version of death, at least not under normal circumstances. Her distress does increase as the game goes on, but that's due to the fact that there are so many dead people all jammed into one space, crying out for relief, not that death itself is positioned as her adversary. Given she is not a healer, but a steward of the graveyard, death's domain, or at least the border of death's domain, a proper funeral is essential, not just for the living, but also, in the case of the town, for the dead. In times past, the kin and the townsfolk had separate burial grounds, but eventually they merged into just one. I love the history here. I love the edifices of the gravestones and the monuments, as well as the wall built strong around it in classic HD, letting nothing free. But Pathologic 2's graveyard is much more haunting, isn't it? We can slip between the stones, and Grace's lodge has a set of stairs that descend into the earth, and we can demand of her that she commune with the dead with Artemy's father Isidore. We can push Grace harder than she has any right to be pushed, just for a few confusing half-answers from the dead Menku. The graves in Pathologic 2 have the chiming bells, a reference to the 19th century invention of the safety coffin by Dr. Johann Gottfried Taberger. Yet because there is the uncanny gothic of the girl who can talk to the dead, the bells almost seem like service requests, not to be dug up and saved from being buried alive, but to be talked to, even while dead. Grace's position as a keeper of the graveyard is made manifest even in the sounds and sights of the cemetery, giving us a truly haunting look into her life, even just by strolling in and out. After the funeral service of Isidore Burak, people in Pathologic 2 tend to try to avoid the graveyard. Death is all around them anyway. Why would we want to be reminded of it in any extra way? Grace, however, is all about death, and in getting to know and appreciate her as a character, we might just be able to get in touch with our own fears and concerns about death, the dead, and dying, and what waits on the other side, even if it just scrapes the surface and makes us wonder, could I have such courage as Grace?
What's happening? Why don't they bring anyone here? It's so quiet.
The bizarre thing about Grace is how quickly I gravitated towards her as a character, yet how much I struggled to write this video. I found her a deeply sympathetic figure, someone that deserves respect and support. Yet how do we actually relate to her? I think the impulse with each and every one of the termites, the Haruspex' ward, his bound, is to protect them. Yet with each of these child characters, some of them as young as 8 years old I think, we're surprised at every turn at their own personal strength and their autonomy. Yes, it is still our duty to protect them as a player and a healer, and in the case of Murky and Sticky and Pathologic 2 in particular, it is our duty to help to raise them. But they each, even as children, have their own goals, their own dreams for the future. We don't see them just as ciphers for us to exact our will on. They don't blindly follow us or our suggestions every time. Grace resists leaving the graveyard. It is not just the society of the town that wants her there, at least for a time. She herself accepts the responsibility placed on her young shoulders, and she does not move easily to relinquish that burden. For Grace, death is a comfort. Death is a stable factor in her life, a certainty, a reliability. It is true for all of us. But this kind of attitude turns death itself on its head. In a game where death is the enemy, where every dead citizen of the town can feel like a personal failing for being unable to stop the plague's rapid spread, Grace's acceptance of death can feel like a bit of an outlier. It is only when the dead cry out for relief that Grace slowly begins to crumble herself, when the job becomes too much for her. It is not that death disturbs, it is that the rapid trauma of the plague destroys. Grace is a character whose strength comes from a thing that often makes us weak and vulnerable. Grace's role in the narrative, thus, is as a way to define a place that otherwise doesn't get much thought or attention. Without her, however, an entire space would be rendered almost meaningless. It would be abandoned and forgotten by players as a mere curiosity, something that exists to serve a function in the game's society, but no function for us as a player. Yet, when she moves on from the graveyard as a potential result of player choice in Pathologic 2, she has the potential to be without it. She is at once a character that defines a space, but who is not wholly defined by it. She is a marvelous character, one with a story that is more than worth telling by the developers at Icepick Lodge, and one that is well worth experiencing and reflecting on for yourself.
My path was called the burden of the living. I just wanted to care for those leaving us behind.
This character analysis has its bones rooted in the year 2021. 2021! That's absurd, right? I don't want to claim I've been working on it restlessly this whole time. There's not like 500 drafts all printed and stuffed into a comically overfull rubbish bin in the corner of my room. But I did want to say that just as a reminder of how long it can take to write what I see as a well-crafted video essay, and amongst all the other things that life has to throw at me. I'm trying my hand at game development, novel writing, poetry writing, while also working and studying. As much as I would love also for these videos to somehow break open the algorithm, I'm also happy knowing that these videos are labours of love for me. They're things that I go out of my way to produce and make for you guys, and they are each little parts of a greater whole, and I make them for myself too. I want to carry this through to the end, this project of pathologic character analysis, not out of a sense of obligation per se, but out of a desire to see this project through. It's been so weird to write these, to return to these, even years after the fact, and to reflect on how much I have changed, and yet how little my interests have. I think this shows that I'm on the right path, that I'm doing what interests me. Again, I hope still that I can make a bigger dent in the YouTube algorithm, but I'm starting to realise that maybe I'll have to do some different things and adjust the channel a bit and play around with it to even have a chance. But I am aiming for a bigger output this year, as you've already seen. This should be my 3rd video essay, and I'm going to do some fun things with the channel. But regardless of what happens, I'm going to keep trying, and I'm going to keep writing. And here's hoping that Grace gets more screen time in Pathologic 3. I'm also going to stream it, so do keep your eyes peeled for that. I'd love to see you there. I would like to thank, as always, my wonderful, wonderful patrons for whom I am endlessly grateful. Frankaloons, Future Cityscape, Blue Voices, Jove, Nos, and Damien. Your support has kept me invested in the channel over these last few years, even last year when my own motivation and mental energy flagged or dipped during periods of burnout. Seriously, I appreciate you all, I really do, and I also appreciate you just for watching, though I would also really love to see you on my Patreon. You can have a chat through Discord there if you join. I'd love to see you there. We have a lot of fun. So I'll see you all next time for the next video. So thanks again one more time. Seriously, I'm so grateful. It's still surreal that I get to do this and people watch and enjoy these. It's really just a dream. It's awesome. So see you again soon. Thank you so much. Stay safe.